Hello, and welcome to Begin Together, a podcast for couples who are healing from infidelity and other forms of deceptive sexuality trauma. I am your host, Janae Lindsay, and I wanted to dive into a question that I had from someone that basically was just wondering about, is it possible for my spouse to develop empathy? And it was coming from a place of really feeling like their partner doesn't have empathy or the capacity to feel. And I've also had this question just really generally because so often betrayed partners will really feel alone on their island of pain, and the betraying partner really may not be showing up or getting it, or they can kind of do this thing where I can show up for a set amount of time, but then I've really reached my limit and then the defenses come in. And so I wanted to dive into this question because one, I think it's really important. Two, I think it's something that we actually are still learning a lot about. And then three, there's a ton of different schools of thought around this. And I have heard everything from you cannot, and you are just stuck with whatever empathy level you have, to it is absolutely 100% possible to develop empathy. And I actually land on that side of things, that it is absolutely possible to develop empathy. And part of that is because that has been my experience, not from a research perspective, but just from a clinical perspective and in working with the clients that I've worked with and really seeing the change, not only from the betraying partner, but also hearing that from the betrayed partner as well, that they are feeling this increase of empathy, understanding, compassion, all of that from their partner. And so I really feel like that has happened enough times within my clinical practice that I have a lot of anecdotal evidence of that, obviously. I have not conducted my own research studies around this, so I'm speaking generally to that. But also, this has totally been on my mind because I recently was at the conference for CSATs, which is the Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. Every year they have an annual conference, and this year it was virtual, but one of the speakers was Dr. Kevin Skinner. If you are familiar with his work, he has done so much in the field of trauma from betrayal and really was one of the leading voices that betrayal shows up like a trauma in the body and that it can have all of those similar symptoms to PTSD. I'll see actually if I can find, I'm pretty confident he had done a TED Talk on it, and I can link that in the show notes for you if I can find it. But I also had the privilege of working with Dr. Skinner. He was my CSAT supervisor. Once you go through your CSAT training, you have to get a ton of hours of supervision and, make sure that you're practicing in an ethical and accurate way. So I got to work with him very directly, not only as my CSAT supervisor, but I also worked for his company as a new intern. And so I have so much respect for Dr. Skinner, but he unpacked this topic in a presentation of empathy. And I was like furiously taking notes because I thought it was so important and so good. And I'm not going to say it as well as he did, but I want to share some of those things that he shared with us and some of the things that I wrote down. So, first, he talked about, what is empathy? When you think of empathy, how are you defining that in your mind? And the way that I often think about empathy is feeling with somebody, and not just feeling with, but I've always thought about validation is making sense of something with your mind. And to me, empathy is making sense of something with your heart or feeling something with your heart. It is that felt sense. It's so much less about what we're saying and it's so much more about how we are showing up. But he really dove into this idea of partners coming into therapy and saying, he doesn't have any empathy and he can't feel my pain. My spouse doesn't feel anything. My spouse doesn't feel pain. He has no empathy, all of that. And as he was saying this, I was like, yes, I have also been in those situations with people who wonder about that, and not just clients. Like, I am also fairly active on social media. People will make comments like that. And I don't know everybody's situation, of course, especially on social media, but it is this generalization that gets thrown out there when a betraying partner has had difficulty staying present in the partner's pain. And not only is that something that gets thrown out there, but I think it's actually a very deep fear through this is that, like, what if my spouse or partner does not have the ability or the capacity to feel and express empathy? And how scary is that? Like, what does that mean if I'm with a person who truly is unable to do that? So I think the stakes are high with this and with this whole concept of, does somebody have empathy or do they not? So basically, Dr. Skinner's whole talk was based on it not being a lack of empathy, but that it is unregulated empathy, or he called it raw empathy. And he referenced Stephen Porges, who is our nervous system king. He is the person who developed the polyvagal theory, if you're familiar with that. But um, basically, this idea of, if I truly feel your pain, then my nervous system will come into play. So if empathy is feeling with somebody and I feel your pain, then how does the brain respond to pain? It goes into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Basically, this idea that a trigger will activate that stress response, and a trigger can certainly be something like raw empathy, this empathy that is unregulated. Really want to look specifically at somebody who hasn't been able to emotionally regulate because of their sexual behaviors. Like, if you think about that whole idea of numbing, turning towards sexual behaviors or sex to numb, this is already a person who has had difficulty staying present with pain, to put it very lightly. So, when it comes to a partner's pain and when it comes to feeling with somebody else, we are asking them to be present with somebody else's anger when they can't even regulate their own emotions, or when they have had significant challenges regulating their own emotions. And often a spouse is going to say something like, they don't care. They don't have empathy. But what Dr. Skinner was saying is that raw empathy bumps into the autonomic nervous system. And it says, I can't deal with this. This is too painful. This isn't the part that Dr. Skinner said, but just from my experience and perspective. But that fight mode sounds a lot like the emotional abuse or integrity abuse or psychological abuse, the things like gaslighting or victim blaming. Dr. Skinner named like retaliation, the whole you're never going to get over this. And then fleeing can also look like the integrity abuse behaviors of turning away from her, withdrawing, shutting down, punishing. And framing it in this way of what is happening in the nervous system that is contributing to that response. And I don't think we can just like fully be like, oh, the nervous system. Like, I don't know that nervous system regulation is the answer to everything, but I just think that this is a helpful framework and part to name. There is in treatment this order of operations, right? Like, the betraying partner has a lot of steps to get to where they need to be before we can even come to a place where we can be practicing this. So empathy of right out of the gates, when I haven't even been able to tolerate my own emotional pain, is so, like, we really would be setting up somebody for failure if we were to expect that in the treatment room. And at the same time, that's obviously something that a spouse and partner so desperately needs, and it's important. And I hope that this can also show that it is possible for it to come. I'm speaking very generally here, of course, but first we have to have that safety to look at Dr. Manwala's 5 stages of treatment really quick. If we're looking at that order of operations, first it's the naming the behaviors, then it's the stabilization, then it's metabolization, and then it is stages 4 and 5, which is the photosynthesis and oxygen. Anyway, we could do a deep dive probably into those sometime. But there is this order of operations. And first, there's addressing the compulsivity and the entitlement and stabilizing all of that, addressing the integrity abuse, stabilizing and stopping those behaviors. That has to happen before we can do any kind of metabolization of the trauma, and really before they're going to be able to receive and hold and be with the partner's pain. And I think that is so devastating and hard for the partner, obviously. But I also think that when somebody is in treatment and they are learning to respond more effectively to their own pain, meaning they're learning to respond to their own vulnerabilities, their own triggers, and be able to cope with those in ways that are healthy and to start choosing paths that are better for their brain and for the relationship and for the family. So in that stabilization process of stopping the compulsive entitled sexual behaviors, of stopping the integrity abuse behaviors, we're also practicing a lot of that nervous system regulation, which should lead into being able to metabolize the trauma, being able to stay present with the victim in their pain. And that's a huge part of Dr. Manwala's stages of treatment. First, we're naming the behaviors. Stage 2, then we are having a stabilization period. Stage 3, then we're starting to do that metabolization of the trauma. And then 4 and 5 is really where there's some beautiful growth happening. And obviously there is growth along the way, but in those beginning stages, especially stage 2 during the stabilization, where you're stopping those behaviors, nervous system regulation and responding more effectively is things like mindfulness, breathing, engaging in more intentional self-care, practicing the conscious consideration of other people. Those things help build that bridge into being able to have more regulated empathy. Dr. Skinner referenced Clara McLaren, who's done so much work on empathy and compassion, and that she says empathy helps us connect with others, feeling alongside someone, understanding them, meeting their needs, loving them, being loved by them. So, one thing that Dr. Skinner named through this is that this idea of shifting out of raw empathy more into a state of compassion and being very clear that that capacity to face and turn towards is a skill that somebody just does not have at the beginning, specifically when they have had a secret sexual basement, right? So Dr. Skinner says when somebody says my spouse doesn't have empathy, he said, let's prove it. It's a learned skill. We're not born with it. We learn it. And I thought that was actually such a bold thing to say, but it also really feels true to me. I don't know about the part of like, we're not born with it. Obviously, it is learned, but I do also think there are people who like come into the world and that is a natural gift of theirs also. But I do think that it is something equally that we learn to be with somebody in their feelings. I think about for my own work because I do believe that I'm a person with like high level empathy. I don't think I could do the work that I'm doing in a way that was effective if I wasn't. I really deeply feel with people. But it makes a lot of sense to me that a big part of why I'm able to do that is because my empathy is regulated, because I'm also a highly regulated person. I do a lot of that nervous system regulation work or really do good caretaking for my own physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, and relational needs. And I know that that kind of care or my personal boundaries, like those are all things that help me show up with high levels of empathy and truly deeply feeling with people. Because I will have people say like, how do you not get super burnt out of your job? And I'm like, the honest answer is that I do not. And it does not exhaust me. And I don't come home from the end of the day like completely depleted. Like all of my reservoirs of empathy are depleted. Like it is in there and it feels very intact. And I know a huge part of that is because of that regulation, boundaries, personal self care in those areas that feel very important to me, the physical, emotional, spiritual, all of that. So those are all pieces that I practice regularly, that one outcome of that is the empathy part. And I just name that because I think that that is very much what's possible when somebody steps into practicing boundaries, practicing emotional regulation, practicing mindfulness, responding effectively to their own emotions, noticing and naming their needs, and all of these other parts, using their voice, having choice, like all of that in my mind does make it more possible to stay present with people in their pain. This was so interesting to me too. Dr. Skinner was sharing that there are some biological differences between empathy and compassion. He said, from a neurological perspective, shame is a social threat to self. And shame doesn't just feel bad, that it shows up in the brain. When shame is high, we have less capacity to feel empathy, which makes so much sense. That whole idea of shame is a social threat to the self. I haven't ever heard it defined that way, actually. I don't think. Like, obviously, that's what's happening, but it makes so much sense when shame is high that the capacity to be there to stay present doesn't happen. And I think about like the outcome of shame is making something about us, right? Somebody going into shame or like victim mode, like nothing I do is ever good enough or I'm totally powerless to change. That is making it about you. That's not looking outward, but also shame is deeply, deeply painful to feel and experience. It just also happens to reduce our empathy and compassion for other people, which is a devastating consequence of it. There's also this idea that emotions are dangerous and we have to suppress them rather than seek to understand them. And that, of course, can come from so many places. But I think the big thing there is just that our brain is so good at getting us out of pain. The brain wants us out of pain every time. And emotions can literally be physically painful to the body. So it would make a lot of sense that they do feel dangerous and that we do have to suppress them. That is the feeling that can come there. But that own personal emotional suppression is going to prevent empathy and being with. So Dr. Skinner also walked through these parts of actually learning that. So when we're thinking about the idea of being with somebody else in their own pain without being overwhelmed by it, Dr. Skinner said that that really requires a level of differentiation, that I am still my separate person and that I can respond in ways that are creating safety rather than being completely overwhelmed by the distress that I'm experiencing of seeing and being with your pain. Sometimes there can be this thing that happens where I could be with you in your pain as long as it's related to somebody else. But as soon as it's about me and the pain that I caused, there can be that total shutdown and just going inward. And Dr. Skinner says what happens in full compassion is that I can feel and feel safe with me. And it really, to me, starts with the feeling does not have to be dangerous. So when I learn to tolerate and respond effectively to my own emotions and my own pain, then I'm going to be able to significantly increase my chances of being able to show up with somebody else in their pain. He talked about the idea of emotional contagion. And he said, think about twins. They have this like immediate emotional absorption. One cries, the other cries. And there's a difference between getting completely, fully absorbed into somebody else's emotional experience rather than having that differentiation. He also named, I thought this was so good, empathic accuracy, which was the capacity to accurately identify someone else's emotions. This idea of you're upset and I can tell. And Dr. Skinner also said when you're in trauma, that you're actually less accurate at reading others' emotions. He said you feel a threat more frequently than the threat is actually present, which I think makes a ton of sense because when you have been through deceptive sexuality trauma, it is like when there's smoke, there's fire. That is the feeling. So if I'm seeing something that feels even slightly off, my own system is going to become activated. And I mean, one thing that I'll say about that is that that's actually a really powerful place for the betraying partner to show up and ride that wave and be with them in it and practice validating, practice having some of that empathy, practice taking some accountability. And that can sound like, even in the moments where a real threat wasn't present, that can sound like the fact that you are having this reaction at all is because of my past behaviors. And I am so deeply sorry for that. Because sometimes what do we do? It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even do anything. Like, why are you freaking out? Or whatever that sounds like. And that is not the play here. It's to still be with them when their body is still feeling threatened. I just wanted to name that part because it makes a lot of sense. It also is hard because when you're the betrayed partner, you are so hypervigilant and you're really attuned to those threats. And the thing is, you don't necessarily know, like something feels off because it is off. But that idea of you feel a threat more frequently than the threat is actually present is interesting. And I don't think the way that we respond to that is by just dismissing your own feelings ever. Like if you feel a threat, whether or not a threat is actually present in that moment, it's still important to tune in and notice that and check in with what you need, right? So just a sidebar to name that. But Dr. Skinner says emotional accuracy is actually critical. Being able to discern anger versus hurt, for instance, is so important. And that we can really do some of that just by even checking in with the other partner. If there is willingness to go like, hey, what is showing up for you right now? It feels like there's a lot of anger. Is that right? Like, am I reading this right? Or what's going on? And giving the space to address the actual emotion that's here. And then again, this idea of emotional regulation. In order to really have empathy, we have to have the ability to stay calm, to tolerate distress, and respond intentionally. And Dr. Skinner added, without regulation, we collapse. Dr. Skinner said, not only can he have empathy, he doesn't know what to do with it. He gets flooded and overwhelmed, and that the goal is to stay present, intentional, skill-based, and productive. We have to change the system and the capacity to be with emotions, the capacity to be with people in their pain. So that shift from raw empathy into compassion, it's going to involve emotional regulation. But it's also the thing that I love about compassion is that it isn't just being with somebody, it's taking loving action. It's showing that not only do I see you and I see you in your suffering, but that I am here and I want to understand. I deeply care. And is there an action that I can take that would help you right now? And compassion also involves healthy boundaries and specifically with healing from deceptive sexuality trauma, consistency, being able to consistently show up and do those things. I hope that this was helpful. When he shared that term, raw empathy, and shifting from raw empathy to compassion, that just felt so clear to me. I do think it makes a lot of sense that this is not about somebody not having the capacity to feel, but it's learning to shift from emotions feeling really dangerous to, okay, I can experience this. I am safe. I can regulate, and then I can show up also for somebody else in their pain. You'll have to let me know how this resonated and landed. I just had heard Dr. Skinner share during this actual presentation, so I don't know if there's other information out there where he has talked about this, but I thought it was so good, and I wanted you all to have some of that learning in case it felt helpful. As always, thank you for being here. I love getting questions from any of you, and I will also just share that I am currently offering a women's group coaching program. We had our first group start, and it's just been such a beautiful experience for me as the coach to be with these women in their experiences, but our next cohort will start in October. So if you're a betrayed partner and you need some support and you're looking for education, accountability, tools, and a group of other women who just get it, then please reach out to me. I will link the program in the show notes as well. It is just something I feel really deeply grateful and called to do right now. So I'm so thankful for that. Take care, all of you. Thank you again. And I'll see you in our next episode. Bye.